was negotiating in a declaration of rights. Like I said the other day, you know, I've had kids and grandkids during that 30 process. Took a
30
long time.
years is a
So, raise your hand.
Can I kindly ask our
And I saw Thank you so much. I think it was a big discussion.
can I kindly ask Penny to join us on the panel?
Yeah. Yeah.
Excellencies, dear delegates. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this side event. I was saying it's a pleasure to convene you to this side event that is convened by the UN Special Rapporteur on Climate Change, Professor Elisa Morgera, to discuss her thematic report to the 59th session of the Human Rights Council entitled The Imperative of Defossilizing Our Economies. This event is sponsored by the European Union and co-sponsored by the Marshall Islands and Panama, all members of the core group on the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change. We will formally launch this event with opening remarks by Her Excellency Ambassador Doreen de Broom, who is the permanent representative of the Republic of the Marshall Islands to the United Nations in Geneva. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Yahweh, everyone, and good morning. Madam Special Rapporteur, comment tada? Fellow panelists, good morning. I thank you for organizing this event and for inviting me to speak, and most of all for your tireless work. Most recently in this important report on defossilizing our economies, your report tells some very hard truth that we all need to hear. It is alarming, especially for a country like mine, which has contributed so little to climate change, but is now reliant on other countries to make this transition away from fossil fuels happen. As I said on Monday in our interactive dialogue, making commitments can be easy. Following through with them can be more difficult. Indeed, even after we agreed in the UNFCCC to transition away from fossil fuels, the same countries continue to extract and use more than ever before. Even though existing fossil fuel infrastructure alone would deliver more emissions than a 1.5-degree pathway can tolerate, countries continue to build new infrastructure, new wells, mines, power plants, and export facilities. The Marshall Islands fully support your report's findings on the need for all states to immediately start developing and implementing defossilization plans and measures. My country remains committed to the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. We were proud to be part of designing this first-of-a-kind framework, which created a lifeline for countries like ours. But we are undeniably frustrated with the speed of progress. We are not doing enough. Once again, we urge all parties to follow through on their commitments, to submit updated NDCs aligned on human rights principles, and to begin urgently to transition away from fossil fuels. And we're pleased to join other climate leaders in the Pacific and Colombia in considering options to go further and faster through the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. We are proud to be part of the coalition on phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. As your report makes clear, the world is subsidizing the fossil fuel industry by $400 billion per year, even while we struggle to mobilize basic climate finance. Removing fossil fuel subsidies alone would cut global emissions by 10%. Furthermore, we are also participating actively in global climate leadership efforts via international legal proceedings. Thanks to deliberations in court like the ICJ, ITLOS, and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, we are building a much clearer picture of states' obligations. We hope that states will take the discussions they've heard in these courts back home and feel even more empowered to rapidly transition away from fossil fuels. These discussions should also inspire the private sector, and it is my sincere hope that collectively we can inspire companies and corporations to rethink their investments. I want to finish by thanking you again, your report, and your report has all the answers we need. Let's work together to exemplify your call to make sure that this council has heard you and will answer it ahead of the next COP in Belém. Como data, and I thank you.
Thank you, Excellency, for these powerful words. For the opening of this event, we are also joined by a youth representative named Feni, who is a climate change advocate and founder of EGABI. Feni, you have now the floor.
It is only human beings that cut trees, make a paper out of the tree, and still writes on the same paper, do not cut trees. Ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed, my name is Feni Ogembo. I'm a climate justice and advocate champion. As the world stands at the brink of irreversible climate diversion, the inclusion of girls and young women in defossilization efforts is no longer optional. It is urgent and necessary. The Special Rapporteur underscores the deep interlinkages between the fossil fuel economy that's widespread of human rights violation. For girls and young women, particularly in my community, this means lives that are marked by food insecurity, displacement, and the denial of basic rights like education, health, and safety. The girls and young women in my community worry that their concerns are not included in the policy spaces. No one has come to ask them how to shift or what will affect them. They do not want to be left behind in the inevitable shift. They want to be counted. They want their voices to matter. The girls and young women in my community worry that they do not have sufficient information for a just energy transition, that this information is not integrated in the education curriculum. The gap in information has been highlighted in the rapporteur's report, and we hope the world will make a better way to break down the information in simple language, understandable not just for the girls and young women, but also at the grassroots level. Girls and young women in my community worry that they are excluded from the resources that are tied to defossilization. Defossilization means a shift of energy sources we are used to, such as firewood, paraffin, but we do not have money to access alternatives, such as the solar energy, even though our lands are filled with sunshine that can power the entire economy. In my community, girls and young women are unfamiliar with technical terms like carbon credit trading. What they deeply understand is the quiet dread that has settled in their lives. They watch powerless as multilateral nations, corporations seize their ancestral land and they can no longer farm or depend for survival. With only 4% of the land in Kenya owned by women, this so-called transition offers no promise, only as uncertainty and their future hanging in limbo. We are not asking for charity, we are demanding for justice. As the world races to redesign its energy future, it must also redesign its commitment to equity. Girls and young women in Africa are not passive bystanders to climate change. We are witnesses, we are survivors, we are ready to be leaders. But to lead, we must be seen, we must be heard, we must be equipped. The energy transition must be a just transition, one that redistributes power, land, and opportunity, one that makes our language, values, our knowledge, honors our right to a future. Anything less is betrayal, just as progress. Let the world not claim to be green while leaving us in the shadows. Let the policy not be passed without our voices. Let the sunlight that powers our continent also light the path for our participation. We are asking to be included at the end. We are not asking to be included at the end. We are insisting on being part from the beginning. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fanny, for this clear call for justice and equity and of inclusivity. To discuss the report of the UN Special Rapporteur, Professor Margera, we are joined on this panel by, as panelist, Mr. Miguel Ruiz, who is in charge of environmental affairs at the Permanent Mission of Colombia to the United Nations. We are also joined by Dr. Iveta Gerasimchuk, Director of the Energy Program and International Strategy at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, known as IISD, and by Ms. Andrea Carmen, who is the Executive Director of the International Indian Treaty Council. As you have heard, the UN Special Rapporteur report is entitled the Imperative of Defossilizing Our Economies, but our discussion will also focus on how we can proceed towards defossilisation throughout international cooperation. And to address the issue, we will address issues including the human rights impacts of fossil fuels throughout their life cycle. We will discuss states' obligations to protect human rights in connection with fossil fuels phase out, the good practices, gaps, and challenges relating to these obligations, as well as the need for international cooperation in the operationalization of the defossilization in the light of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities and other principles of international law. A lot of topics that we have heard in the events that the Special Rapporteur has been contributing to this week. So without further ado, we will now give the floor to the Special Rapporteur for a few words on the report. You have the floor.
Well, thank you so much first to the ambassador and all the distinguished and very inspiring panelists with us today. We've had, I think, a very meaningful interactive dialogue earlier this week on the report, but of course, there's so much more to discuss, and I'm really grateful for all of you that made the time to be here to reflect more together about the findings of the report, what they mean, how you may see them being implemented in your countries and in the context of international cooperation. Maybe just to echo the words of Ambassador Bram, there were very many hard truths I've learned in preparing that report, and very many truths that were very hard to surface in preparing that report. And in many ways, like to resonate also what Penny just said, many of these truths are preventing all of us from protecting and fulfilling our rights to self-determination. So that untangling all the dimensions of both domestic action, but internet as well as international cooperation that will make up the space for us to move towards a different economic model that can free us from fossil fuels and set us on a more effective, rapid path towards a safer climate is essential. And I think there's of course a lot that can be said around the domestic responsibilities of historically high emitting states as well as currently high emitting states. I think for all of them, of course, the question of how we defossilize the economies will be a crucial matter of very participatory, inclusive processes to develop and clarify the path, while the overall obligations to phase out fossil fuels and all forms of financing that are keeping them well rooted in our economic models is, I think, very clear as a matter of existing international human rights law. How we go about it has also important implication and needs to be fully grounded in a human rights-based approach. And critically, in my report, I emphasize not only the role of human rights as a legal direction for our action, but also as a crucial area of practices and evidence for transformation, for transformative practices, for meaningful conversations where we can together imagine what our economic system should be like. In terms of international cooperation, then, I think there are some obvious implications in terms of prioritizing international funding, capacity building, and technology co-development to support every state, and particularly those that have less capabilities and responsibilities in advancing on their path to defossilization. And as Penny was saying, those processes need to be inclusive from the outset of all the human rights holders who are most affected by climate change and those who might be most affected by the phase out. And that includes both domestic population, but also representatives of states who are dependent on fossil fuels and the states who are most dependent on that effective phase out. Crucially, I've learned in preparing this report that there isn't very much research funding for global North, global South cooperation on developing pathways towards a renewable-based economy. This is crucial because of all those interdependencies of how our global fossil fuel-based economy works. And on the other hand, we see increasing amount of funding, public and private, going into other areas of climate action that may not have the same scientifically backed effectiveness in course, changing our course towards at least a 1.5 aligned path. I've also received testimonies and started to understand how there are some dynamics, how through international cooperation, we may have an effect of locking in countries in the global south into fossil fuel production and use, or dumping on fossil fuel based activities in those countries. And that may be a way in which the industry may try and continue to expand, even when we are taking meaningful action to phase out elsewhere. And so it is essential for every state to really be very mindful and attentive to whether either technologically or through financial and other means, international cooperation may work against any progress we can make in terms of defossilizing our economies. I think the aspect of information and combating disinformation is essential to make meaningful progress, and that should be part of how international cooperation advances. And that is, I think, a crucial element that plays out in multiple international fora that are relevant for making progress on defossilization. I mean, of course, the International Climate Forum itself. We haven't made progress on phasing out fossil fuels. We haven't even been discussing phasing out fossil fuels. And the element of prioritizing the discussion as a matter of science-based approach that can be the most effective at this juncture is essential. But we also have ongoing UN negotiations on plastics, which again provide huge opportunities to tackle another area beyond the energy sector where fossil fuel companies are expanding, significantly expanding and projecting significant expansion in the future. And I have heard that it is quite difficult to have that conversation and to have textual suggestions that would be critical in that connection. Equally, ongoing UN negotiations on tax cooperation will be essential to really look at all those areas in the tax systems, in illicit financial transactions, in the lack of transparency of the tax system that still allow fossil fuels to receive significant financing, to leverage even more financing, and not to contribute to national budgets, including in the countries most affected by climate change, which has the obvious impact on that insufficient climate finance that is being made available to the countries most affected by climate change and least responsible for it. And finally, there's a whole area of deep reform that has been recognized as needed for quite a few years already within the international human rights law community. And that is the area of international investment law, the protection of foreign investors that fossil fuel companies are very much taking advantage of in ways that limit genuine, legitimate action at the national level to defossilize our economies, to protect our human rights, and subjecting governments to exorbitant fines that wouldn't even be available under their own domestic systems. We need international foreign investment to be fully aligned and in support of that transformation towards renewable-based economies And we can't afford having the system instead working against any progress that can be made at the national level. So the report is both a very deep call to all countries that are fossil fuel producers or that are in different ways contributing to the financing of fossil fuels to take immediate and very systemic action, both domestically, but crucially at the same time in their international cooperation on a bilateral and multilateral level for those recommendations to have an effective impact in this decade. And I look forward to further exploring this with all of you.
Thank you very much, Madam Special Rapporteur. So to explore these messages, we will start our discussion with Mr. Miguel Ruiz from Colombia. Miguel Ruiz, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Diana. Thank you very much for the invitation and to the Special Rapporteur for her report. I think that the issue of this being imperative to phase out fossil fuels has been well made by the Special Rapporteur here and in her report. It's not only imperative for climate change, but also, and I think this is a very important point, for poverty reduction and for the protection of persons in vulnerable situations. Climate change is an existential threat to those that are most vulnerable, but ultimately, as it develops, to all of us as a species, and particularly to future generations. The climate crisis that is primarily caused by fossil fuels has wide-ranging implications, and I don't think we need to gloss over these, and I think it's important to touch upon them. They are not exclusively limited to our consideration of climate change, but also to the implications that it has for biodiversity loss, for pollution, for human mobility, for causing conflicts, and these consequences that are all negative consequences will continue to intensify as the climate crisis intensifies. Really, the message that we would like to convey is that these wide-ranging implications require diverse efforts in different fora. And of course, we tend to focus on UNFCCC, where Colombia has been introducing language on transition away from fossil fuels for several cycles now. Unfortunately, we still have been unable to include this language in UNFCCC outcomes. But also, we have been championing this issue in other fora, particularly in CBD and chemicals and waste negotiations, and of course, as the ambassador has already mentioned, in joining the initiative for a non-proliferation of fossil fuels treaty that we think also sends an important and clear message that there is a convergence building around the notion that this is an imperative for protecting the human rights of future generations. But I'd like to focus on 3 things specifically that I think are particularly important. Further from the negotiations that I think we all have in mind, I think there's other things that we also need to bear in mind to focus on. Negotiations tending to the issue of science particularly are very important. I think the creation of the ISP-CWP that was achieved a couple of weeks ago in Punta del Este was particularly important in establishing for, after more than 20 years of discussing these issues, a panel on chemicals, waste, and pollution, which also contributes to finalizing the design around science policy panels of the triple planetary crisis. So we already have IPCC, we already have IPBES, and now we've closed the loop, in essence, with the establishment of ISP-CWP. This is important because information and science is vital in fighting disinformation and defeating false narratives that have hindered our fight against climate change. I think another issue that is particularly important and that is touched upon in the report is the regulation of inefficient transition away from fossil fuels. And so when we were discussing, for example, the negotiations on plastics, I think that's also an important thing to keep an eye on. There is quite a bit of discussion around the importance of transition away from fossil fuels as fuels, but I think it's also important to keep in mind that there is transition pathways which are entirely unsustainable. So from fuels to, for example, single-use plastics, which are extremely inefficient for carbon capture and that have clear both human rights implications, but also environmental implications when it comes to pollution and waste. And of course, a transition that is also focused on petrochemicals, particularly on pesticides, which are not necessarily needed, but for which products are, in essence, demand is created artificially. And so it's important to think about not only how we transition away from fossil fuels as fuels, but when we think about how we're going to use these products in the future, that we do so in a way that is also efficient and that's environmentally sustainable. And finally, and I think that's why we're all here, the issue of human rights. The belief of my country is that the triple planetary crisis is the defining human rights challenge of our time. It threatens all human rights, and most particularly in developing countries such as ours. And so what we think is also important to have these discussions here in this context. That's why we brought forward last year a first resolution on human rights and biodiversity that also tackles the issue of nature-based solutions, ecosystem-based approaches, and makes that connection between biodiversity and climate change. And we've continued our fight within the climate change and human rights resolution, which we will continue to insist on the inclusion of fossil fuel language and 1.5 degrees Celsius consistent pathways. The main issue that we need to grapple with really is that while convergence is being built around the importance of responding to climate change in a way that is efficient and that is transformative and that is consistent with 1.5 degree pathways, we also need to grapple with the fact that multilateral diplomacy, and I think everyone in the room understands this, is slow. It works slowly. And sadly, we do not have the time to allow these issues to develop at the normal glacial pace at which our negotiations advance. And so we need to be creative and we need to be as ambitious as possible in finding ways to transition away from fossil fuels as fast as possible, to agree on pathways that will take us to our objectives and that will ultimately defend and protect human rights as best as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ruiz. And to bring also here the links with other negotiations ongoing at this moment that are important for what we are discussing here. Now it's our pleasure to turn to our next panelist, Ms. Iveta Gerasimuncic from ISD. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Madam Chair. Fellow Special Reporters, thank you very much for the invitation. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. So from the perspective of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, we are working on transitioning away from fossil fuels for many years, even though it wasn't coined this way, and in particular on the reform of fossil fuel subsidies. Our Global Subsidies Initiative celebrates 20 years anniversary this year. So we see this report as very, very timely and calling in an urgent way to action and spending potentially the ammunition that we all need to bridge the gap between the climate science, the needs of sustainable development, and the reality. So thank you very much for this ammunition that the human rights community can also use. So the current gap that we have between climate change risks and the reality stark. We know from scenarios analysis that there is absolutely no room for new oil and gas and coal expansion, which could be compatible with 1.5 degrees scenario under the Paris Agreement. We're probably going to miss 1.5 degrees, unfortunately. But even like fighting for every fraction of the degree matters. We also know that the demand for fossil fuels even according to more conservative scenarios from the International Energy Agency, is going to peak by 2030. Still, what we see are multiple plans from businesses, but also from governments themselves for expansion. So according to the production gap report, there is still a plan to produce twice the amount of fossil fuels that is compatible with 1.5 degrees. And it's a big risk for a just, fair, and equitable transitioning away from fossil fuel that the world committed to at COP, in IEEE COP28 2 years ago. So, and our focus is also on the financial resources which this transition will require. And at the moment, private, but also still public finance is still going in the wrong direction. So even the most conservative estimates of fossil fuel subsidies put their value at 1.5 trillion per year. The report, special rapporteur makes it's very clear. And this is the money that could be used for sustainable development, for various social causes, but also for the defossilization of the economy, for just transition, and for support to clean energy. There were various commitments in different groups, speaking of the multi-form approach to reform these public financial flows in G7, G20, in UNFCCC. And there were various first mover initiatives, or like several countries groups initiatives that try to promote this agenda. The Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform, which is also active in the WTO here in Geneva through the Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform Initiative, but also the newly launched coalition on phasing out fossil fuel incentives, including subsidies. None of this is legally binding yet. One negotiated small agreement which makes fossil fuel subsidy reform legally binding is the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability Act, which came to conclusion last year and includes Switzerland, Costa Rica, New Zealand, and Iceland. It's still pending ratification. It creates some precedent for disciplining fossil fuel subsidies. Collectively, where we are at is some kind of maybe standstill, ideas of standstill on expansion. So this is less than required in terms of phase out, but the slow glacial progress that we did mention. Unfortunately, there are still a lot of loopholes, which different fossil fuel interests can use to escape commitments. But however, like we see the writing on the wall, as I mentioned, the demand for fossil fuels is going to peak. So the question is how we prepare for it. There will be more fight for maintaining the fossil fuel economy in legal ways and non-legal ways in different forms. That's also very clear. But overall, this transition is bound to happen also because of the clear progress of renewables and the risks of climate change, which become more and more visible. So ultimately, this is not a question of this transition, social, economic, and environmental transition is question of, not a question of if, it's a question of when. And the report of the special rapporteur makes this when close. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yvette, for your inputs. The last panelist speaking before we open the floor for the reactions of the room is Ms. Andrea Carmen from the International Indian Treaty Council. You have the floor.
I have a PowerPoint, I think. You can start. Before I begin to speak, I just want to say that I want to dedicate my remarks to Ken Saro-Wiwa of the Ogoni people of Nigeria. We were in close solidarity with the Ogonis here at the commission, then it was called on human rights, making sure they had an ECOSOC status to be able to speak, to try to save his life for his resistance against the extreme human rights violations and environmental contamination caused on the Ogoni land by the activities of Shell Oil. Unfortunately, we were not able to save his life, but that was the time before the concept of human rights defenders was embedded in United Nations human rights system. So I just want to recall one of the first assassinated human rights defenders among indigenous peoples that were assassinated for standing up against the development of fossil fuels. In that spirit, I want to recognize that, as the special rapporteur did the other day at the panel, that indigenous peoples have science, time-tested, well-known science. And one of the first scientists that spoke on this issue to me, as actually a young woman, supporting the struggle against the forced relocation of the Dene or Navajo elders that were opposing expanded coal mining on their reservation, Roberta Blackgoat, shown here, said coal is the liver of Mother Earth. It needs to stay in her body for her to be healthy. And that might sound like very nice traditional way of speaking, but I really realized later what she was talking about when a friend of mine, the tribal member, began to sell these water filters that had been millions of dollars of scientific development to take out the toxics on your water from the sink coming out. And the active ingredient was called activated carbon. It was coal. And coal filters water in the earth. And that's what she means, like our liver filters toxins in our body. But for her, her expression was recognizing our view of Mother Earth as a living woman, a living body. So that's an example of the prophetic indigenous science and the warning about what we're talking about on this very day. Just to place the human rights context for indigenous peoples of this discussion, the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, our internationally recognized minimum standard, recognizes in Article 26 our rights to our traditional lands, territories, and resources, of course, including water, and calls on states, saying states shall recognize our land tenure. This is one of the most greatly violated rights in the UN Declaration, the right to free, prior, informed consent and development. And this picture is of activity that became known around the world, the opposition of the Lakota peoples against the Dakota Access Pipeline, bringing oil through their territory right under the Missouri River, a source of water for not just indigenous peoples, but millions of people in the United States. And it's already leaked. It went through, they weren't able to stop it, and it's already leaked. We know from the United Nations that the climate crisis is threatening, they say, more than 1 million species, many of which are vital for the survival of indigenous peoples, and also our cultural identity, our spiritual relationships, as well as our nutrition and food systems. This is just one example, the Chinook salmon in California that are predicted to become extinct by the end of the century, that are vital for the food systems of the California indigenous peoples and all along the Pacific coast up to Alaska. We have to recognize in this discussion that COP28 reconfirmed, we were finally able to get in the outcomes document there, the emissions reduction concept. And we noticed that at COP28, speaking to many different countries, they stopped talking about fossil fuel reduction and started talking about emissions reduction, focusing on carbon capture and those kinds of elements. And a lot of people might not have noticed that difference, but we certainly did. However, and I'll give the United States example, in both 2022 and 2023 and 24, domestic oil production reached the highest level in history. And this is after making these commitments. And as of 2025, President Trump, via executive order, the protected area of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge that the Gwich'in have fought to protect for decades. The calving ground of the porcupine caribou herd, they call it the place where all life begins, has been declared open for oil and gas exploration and development just this year. Another example is the tar sands in Canada, where back in 2008, the chiefs that have legally binding treaties with Canada call for a moratorium on the tar sands development until the environmental and human rights aspects could be fully understood. But here in the map, it shows the plans for expansion of the tar sands in spite of this. And we're talking about many dead fish, elevated cancer rates, and others. Shockingly, while we were at SB in Bonn, UNFCCC, we saw many press announcements that Brazil was opening up oil and gas auctions that could create a higher rate of emissions than in the last 11 years. They're fully developed. Many are offshore, but some are actually in the Amazon region. And there are many news reports. I'm just quoting one here from 350.org. I've spoken here several times about the idea of just transition and challenging the way that the pursuit of transition minerals is going forth. This is just 2 lithium mines on indigenous territories that I've spoken about. But the point we're saying here is that this is not being treated as a real transition. It's not an alternative to fossil fuel development. Just these cases I mentioned here, and there are many more if I had more time, show that this is in addition to, not instead of, fossil fuel development. We've received some very strong recommendations from some of the UN treaty bodies about this regarding our treaty rights and the rights of indigenous peoples regarding extractive industries. This is an excerpt from the Human Rights Committee concluding observations of the United States compliance. And it specifically talks about violation of human rights of indigenous peoples. And just to end, I just want to leave you with this picture from Fort Chipewyan, Alberta, Canada, indigenous children outside of a tar sands oil refinery. And our call is indigenous peoples. This is a protest against a pipeline in the United States to keep fossil fuels in the ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Carmen, for bringing concrete examples to this panel discussion. We'll now open the floor. If anybody in the room would like to contribute to the discussion, and in the meantime, I also turn to the special rapporteur in case she wants to have a first reaction to what we heard from the other panelists.
Yes, no, thank you so much. Maybe just reacting to what Andrea has shared with us. Well, first of all, just to honor that knowledge that was shared with us, the coal is the liver of Mother Earth. And yeah, just I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine saying, but there must be some meaning for fossil fuels being in the ground, but we, I guess Western or in Europe don't know what that is. And I think that's critical. I mean, one of the points in the defossilization report is really about understanding our path towards different economic models, very much aligned with like planetary health. And Western science is catching up with indigenous science, at least catching up in recognizing the importance of indigenous science. And so I think, yeah, sharing that knowledge is really, I think, important to understand what, in terms of the science and understanding what path we need ahead, and how important the inclusive spaces for us to learn from indigenous knowledge is. And also that point on critical minerals and understanding, which will be the report I'm working on this year for the General Assembly. There are two critical points that should be part of our inclusive processes of understanding how we can move away from a fossil fuel-based economy. And one is questioning energy demands and energy demand projections that are driving that search for fossil fuels, for critical minerals, which is replicating the same patterns of human rights violations, particularly for indigenous peoples' human rights, but also for others, and including for our own human right to a healthy environment, and might not even be really moving us towards an alternative path, but in fact keeping us or adding to the environmental harm and the human rights harm that we are experiencing due to fossil fuels and their contributions to climate change. But there are also more intricate relationships. There are links between continued fossil fuel use and critical minerals, and all of that, again, is part of those hard truths that we very much need to bring to the surface and to be the critical evidence that we need to base our actions upon. So I'll just stop there for now and see maybe any contribution from the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Sergeant. Looking at the floor, yes, the young lady, you have the floor. If you could kindly introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm Pascal Imiboke Uganda. I am also a young woman, girl and woman, and an advocate. I would love to pose a question to the lovely young lady there, Femi Okembo, and also to Professor, because she has done the groundwork. My question is with regards to safeguarding of human rights defenders. I have listened to Carmen's presentation. I really wish she could go deeper, but then I was like, if she goes deeper, I will not get to ask Femi and Professor that question. And I really want to hear their opinion. So Feni, I would want to know, as these fossil projects are being phased out, how do we ensure that human rights defenders, especially girls and young women like you, are protected and supported from retaliation and violence, especially in the context of authoritarian practices? How would you want to be protected and supported? How would that look like for you as a young woman? And for Professor, what recommendations do you think you can pose to the actors to ensure that becomes a reality? Because it may be a reality in one state, but not in one that has authoritarian practices. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before the funding and discussion rapporteur reply to the questions, I'm looking at the room. Any other hands or name plates? So, Fanny, I'd like you have the floor.
Thank you, Pascalia. I think for me, it's on the reporting mechanisms that we have right from our national levels, regional to global. Am I safe when I am out with a placard saying we need to protect our community, we need to protect our land, we need to protect our environments? Am I safe? That's how I look at it. Will I have a place to run to and say, I went out, according to the Constitution, I am allowed to demonstrate, I am allowed to ask for human rights. Am I able to voice out my opinion? They'll hear me and take action. So for me, I would say the reporting mechanisms are the ones to help us as girls and young women advocate for us not only to feel safe, but also to access justice. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Fanny. Madam Special Rapporteur.
Thank you so much for raising this point. And I think the reality is that the more we bring to light those realities around continued expansion of fossil fuels and also the financing that's going with that, the more the risks and the severity of the attacks against environmental human rights defenders will be. We've already witnessed that to a point where I think we are rightly wondering around the erosion of our democratic processes. the more and more widespread misuse of our judicial systems, including in the context of Standing Rock and the organizations that worked in solidarity with the water defenders. And the more that I think we need to both really connect all our efforts to protect environmental human rights defenders, making sure they're present and suited for different regional realities, which I think the Office of the High Commissioner and many other partners are working towards. But I think the other aspect that maybe we can improve is as early on prevention as possible. Part of my report was really looking at the now very extensive independent research on what we call the playbook of fossil fuel companies in attacking defenders, be that scientists, being that young people protesting, any really voice calling out for the phase out. And we know now, we have documented very carefully how those defenders are attacked, the progression of the attacks, the different ways those attacks are being brought about. And we all need to be fully geared towards preventing those foreseeable attacks. So I think there's an element of both ensuring that all the response measures are available, are well known, and that we look at whether there are any gaps across multiple initiatives that exist to protect environmental human rights defenders. That's another element of international cooperation. But I think crucially, we also need to really think strategically around, are our initiatives sufficiently geared towards prevention vis-a-vis what we know around the playbook? And we have that knowledge now, and we need to really, again, put it at the center of our efforts to protect defenders.
I was going to see if I can make a brief comment to that. I really wholeheartedly support what Elisa said about safeguards and prevention for everything that we're talking about, including climate change in general, not just what are we going to do after when violations have happened. I want to bring up an issue that I didn't have time to raise, but that you've made me think of, is the importance of the issue of environmental violence tied to extractives, including fossil fuels. We have succeeded in getting the CDOT to include in its 2022 General Recommendation 39 on Indigenous women and girls, the concept of environmental violence that came from Indigenous women in grassroots communities suffering pesticides and different kinds of deliberate exposures to known very hazardous materials. But also we are able to highlight the ties between extractives, including oil, like in a place like the Balkan oil fields in North Dakota, United States, of sexual violence, exploitation, and trafficking of Indigenous women and girls, and boys for that matter, also from the man camps, and you know, the kind of way of bringing in all of these workers and in Indigenous territories and next to Indigenous territories. And I think that needs to be highlighted when we're talking about any kind of extractive industries, either expanded fossil fuels or these so-called transition minerals will be the same thing, the same kind of thing. And I think it's a very underreported, under-addressed form of human rights violations, environmental violence tied to extractives. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cameron. Looking again at the room. Yes, this young lady, please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. My name is Maboki Nzioka. I work for FEMNET. I am the regional coordinator for Girls and Young Women. My question is to the professor again, sorry. As we get towards COP, I'm wondering if you have a word of advice, particularly for African girls and young women. Is there a way you would advise for us to prepare to present our position? Are there any platforms you would recommend? Are there any reports you would point us to, or just give us pointers on how to participate at COP this year? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. And I might have replied differently last year as we were preparing for COP29. For COP30, there's quite a lot of I think innovation that the Brazilian presidency is putting into place, and it's still quite difficult to understand where would be maybe new spaces to be heard, particularly as young people, young women, children, I'm hoping. But But at the same time, we have constituencies who have engaged for a long time in the climate process, and I find that maybe there could be more solidarity on their part to reach out to younger generations who are keen to be part of the process, to build on their knowledge as well, to navigate the process, but also learn from the colleagues who work towards protecting environmental human rights defenders at COPs as well, to learn from them what are the safeguards, what are the approaches. So I guess there's maybe three things I can say around, preparing for COP. First, that hopefully all the constituencies who have been for a long time active in bringing civil society voices, human rights holders' voices into COP, to work even more in close collaboration with each other and supporting younger women and others who maybe are coming for the first time into that space. I think the networks are open, but sometimes it's really insider knowledge to be connected meaningfully across. The second is that climate COPs might not be the place where we are going to be heard. I think there is now a track record of how civil space is shrinking, including for UN agencies, including for other experts. And I think we need to, of course, let's keep open and demand for spaces to be heard meaningfully within COP, but also start to think about other processes where we need to be present, where we need to make the same demands, and where maybe we have more real opportunities to be heard and develop an alternative practice that can be brought to bear and be brought as a counterpoint to the practices that are currently being dominated in the climate regime. I think building also on the contributions from our Colombian colleague, for instance, I'm thinking that we have a new treaty on the high seas. This is a treaty that's just been developed that has reference to indigenous knowledge, small-scale fishers knowledge, where I think there's opportunities to protect children's rights as well. And that will be crucial for climate as well, for the climate-ocean nexus that's been for such a long time not even considered in the climate regime, and we're still lagging behind. So I think, a lot of us are putting a lot of efforts and energies in being a climate COPs, and we should keep doing that, but equally thinking whether we have enough advocates and enough young voices and women's voices in other fora, such as the plastics treaty negotiations, such as the tax convention negotiations, where we have critical root causes issues of the climate crisis, because not all of these things are being discussed at the climate COP. And the spaces for being heard have been for a very long time, very narrow, sometimes even unsafe. That said, I think what the Brazilian presidency is putting into place is worth exploring. And I'm hoping that there are quite a few layers of experts and movements around the Brazilian presidency, and it'll be really good to really put that question to them as well. How are spaces and truly listening spaces for young women from Africa, from other regions being prepared, being safeguarded, and what do we need to know now to be better prepared to make use of those spaces by the time that the COP comes?
Thank you, Madam Special Rapporteur. It's now time to close this event. I just want to remind everybody that there is an event at 2 p.m. in room 25 that continues the discussion on the report of the Special Rapporteur and of its key messages. And there will be other talks where we are going to discuss environmental human rights defenders and other related issues with the UN Special Rapporteur in the margins of the council that are taking place on Thursday and Friday. And with that, Madam Special Rapporteur, a few last words that you want to give to this assembly before we finally close the event.
Just to encourage you and thank you already for any opportunity to keep this conversation going. There are many places where we can keep discussing how the report can be implemented and support many existing initiatives that I wasn't able to acknowledge in the report, but they all play a part. I think any minilateralism, creative ways in which we can show that defossilization is possible, it's already happening, and it's what we need and what we can do is essential too. So I thank you and encourage you to keep that conversation going.
Thank you. And again, I think we're going to plan